Air in the makeshift command center, deep beneath the scarred Martian surface, crackled with a tension thicker than the dust storms outside. Kalen stood across the reinforced table from General Varkas, the Jovian's sheer physical presence a suffocating weight in the confined space. This wasn't a meeting of allies, but a negotiation between two predators, forced together by the chaotic currents of the Civil War, each assessing the other's teeth and claws. Varkas, a man built like a battle tank with eyes like chips of ice, spoke with a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the rock itself. He laid out the terms of their proposed alliance with brutal clarity, a temporary merging of forces, pooling resources and intelligence for specific, mutually beneficial objectives. There was no pretense of shared ideology, only the cold, hard logic of power. Kalen listened, his jaw tight. Every word Varkas uttered was a hammer blow against the fragile remnants of his former ideals. This was the man whose fleets had annihilated populations, whose soldiers were rumored to commit unspeakable acts. To stand here, to even consider joining forces with him, felt like spitting on the graves of everyone he had sworn to protect. But the war demanded sacrifices, not just of lives and material, but of the soul. Kalen's forces were battered, his resources stretched thin. Varkas offered strength, numbers, and a strategic advantage that Kalen desperately needed to survive, to continue the fight against other, equally monstrous factions vying for the throne. He felt the familiar, sickening twist in his gut, the sensation that had become a constant companion since the war began eroding his idealism. Survival wasn't clean, victory wasn't pure. It was a messy, bloody crawl through compromises and betrayals, and this alliance with Varkos was perhaps the most significant moral descent yet. Varkos watched him, a flicker of something akin to amusement in those cold eyes. He understood the struggle on Kalen's face. Varkos thrived in this moral vacuum, saw it as the natural state of things. He offered a path forward, stained with the blood of innocence, but a path nonetheless, where Kalen's current trajectory seemed to lead only to honorable, but ultimately futile, destruction. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Kalen thought of the people depending on him, the rebels who still looked to him as a symbol of hope, however tarnished that symbol had become. Could he protect them by making a deal with the devil? Or would this alliance simply damn them all? He clenched his fists, the decision solidifying with a grim finality. Justice had proven a luxury the war could not afford. Survival, power, tactical advantage. These were the new gods he had to appease. He met Varkos's gaze, the last flicker of his former self extinguishing in the cold resolve that hardened his features. "We have an understanding, General," Kalen said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. The words tasted like ash. The alliance was forged not in trust, but in mutual necessity and a shared willingness to navigate the darkest corners of the conflict. Stepping away from the table, Kalen felt the weight of the compromise settle upon his shoulders. He had gained a powerful, dangerous ally, but the cost was immeasurable. He had traded a piece of his soul for a chance at victory, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that the war was far from done taking its toll. While the fragile, blood-sealed pact with Varkos tightened like a noose around Keelan's neck, another, far older thread of loyalty remained unbroken in the shadows. High above the scarred surface of Earth, aboard a battered orbital station cloaked by asteroid debris, Kalen met with General Hawk. The air between them crackled, not with hostility, but with the grim understanding of men forced into impossible positions. Hawk, the unyielding leader of Earth's desperate rebels, bore the weight of a dying planet in his eyes. His uniform, patched and faded, spoke of endless skirmishes and impossible odds. He offered Kalen a stark contrast to Varkos's brutal opulence, a reminder of the cause Kalen had once championed before the war's grim calculus began eroding his soul. Their communication channels were encrypted with layers that would make even the most paranoid Jovian strategist sweat. Meetings were rare, fleeting moments snatched in the void, each second thick with the risk of discovery. This was not an alliance of convenience built on mutual strength, but a desperate gamble born of shared desperation and a common, formidable enemy. Kalen felt the strain of the deception pulling him taut. One moment he was nodding along to Varkos's grand, merciless strategies. The next he was huddled with Hawk, dissecting those same plans for weaknesses. The duplicity was a bitter pill, yet necessary, he told himself, for survival, for a different kind of victory that Varkos could never comprehend. Hawk's voice, though weary, held the steel of unbroken resolve. He spoke of Earth's suffering, the relentless sieges, the dwindling resources, the innocent lives caught in the grinder. Each word was a quiet accusation, a stark reminder of the ideals Kalen was rapidly abandoning in his quest for power and tactical advantage. Their plotting was meticulous, focused on leveraging Kalen's newfound, albeit temporary, proximity to Varkos. They weren't just exchanging information, they were weaving a trap, a dangerous snare designed to capitalize on Varkos's arrogance and Kalen's compromised position. The stakes were astronomical, failure meaning certain death for both of them, and the final subjugation of Earth. Kalen found himself increasingly relying on Anya's technical prowess to maintain the clandestine link with Hawk. Her discomfort with his escalating moral compromises was palpable, a silent judgment that gnawed at him. He kept the full extent of his double dealing from her, knowing it would shatter the last vestiges of her trust. The Martian leader justified his actions by telling himself this was the only way to truly strike at the heart of the tyranny Varkos represented. An open fight was suicide. A calculated betrayal, however repugnant, offered a slim chance. He was becoming the monster he fought, a chilling reflection in the dark mirror of war. Hawk understood the immense personal risk Kalen was taking. His gaze held a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, acknowledging the darkening path Kalen walked. They were two commanders bound by a shared necessity, navigating a treacherous landscape where the only constant was betrayal. Every coded message received, every whispered conversation in the vacuum of space, solidified the dangerous game Kalen was playing. He was dancing on a knife's edge, balancing two opposing forces, knowing that at any moment the delicate equilibrium could shatter, burying him and everything he fought for under the weight of his own deceit. The airlock hissed shut, sealing Kalen inside the cramped utilitarian space. Dust motes danced in the single overhead light, remnants of Martian grit clinging to his boots. Across from him, Hawk, his face etched with the relentless strain of leading Earth's battered rebellion, nodded a silent greeting. This meeting, brokered through layers of encrypted channels and blind jumps, was a dangerous gamble, a fragile thread of trust woven through the brutal tapestry of the Civil War. They sat on hard metal crates, the hum of the small transport ship barely audible. Hawk didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice, usually a rallying cry, was low and urgent. Varkos is moving on Sector Gamma next week. Your forces are slated to join his spearhead. It's the chance we need, Kalen. Kalen felt the familiar tension coil in his gut. Working with Varkos, the Jovian general whose name was synonymous with atrocity, was a bitter pill he'd forced himself to swallow for strategic gain. Now, Hawk was asking him to turn that poisoned alliance into a weapon. Hawk leaned forward, sketching lines on a data slate. The plan is complex, high risk. We'll stage a defense in Gamma, make it look like a desperate, chaotic stand. Varkos will commit his main force, expecting easy conquest with your support. My role? Kalen's voice was flat, devoid of the fire that had once defined him. The war had a way of stripping that away, leaving only cold calculation. You lead your battalions as ordered, right into the heart of the engagement, Hawk explained, his eyes locking onto Kalen's. You push alongside Varkos's units, creating the illusion of a unified front. But your objective isn't ours, it's his command structure. He tapped a point on the data slate. We'll have teams embedded, ready to expose their flanks. When the signal comes, you pull the trigger, Kalen. Your guns turn on Varkos's troops. They'll be surrounded, hammered from the front by us, and from the rear by you. Betrayal in the heat of battle, Kalen murmured, the words tasting like ash. He'd betrayed before, but this was on a scale that could shatter alliances across the sector, paint him irrevocably as a backstabber. Hawk's expression hardened. It's war, Kalen. There are no clean hands left. If Varkos takes Earth, millions die, enslaved, broken. This is our best shot to decapitate his command, throw his advance into chaos, buy ourselves time. The risk to my own forces. Kalen started, thinking of the men and women who followed him, who trusted him. They'll be in danger regardless, Hawk countered grimly. Either fighting this battle under Varkos's brutal command, or caught in the crossfire when we make our move. With you leading the turn, you control the angle. You can minimize their exposure, relatively speaking. He paused, letting the weight of his proposal hang in the air. This isn't about glory, Kalen. It's survival. It's about taking down the biggest threat to everything we're fighting for. It's brutal, yes, but necessary. Kalen stared at the data slate, at the lines representing troop movements, traps, and ultimately, the planned bloodbath. The path ahead was clear, horrifying in its cold logic. To save some, he had to sacrifice his already tarnished honor and condemn others. He looked up, met Hawk's unwavering gaze. There was no easy answer, only the next impossible choice in a war defined by them. The trap was set, not just for Varkos, but for Kalen's soul. General Hawk, his face etched with the grim lines of countless battles fought on a ravaged Earth, leaned over the holographic display. The projected map of the planet, scarred by orbital bombardments and ground warfare, pulsed with tactical markers. Kalen stood beside him, the flickering light casting long, uncertain shadows across his features. This was the nexus of their secret pact, a desperate gamble conceived in the blood-soaked dust of the rebellion. "The plan is intricate, Kalen," Hawk began, his voice a low rumble. "It requires perfect timing and absolute commitment from your forces. Varkos expects a unified front, a hammer blow against what he believes is the core of our resistance here on the surface." He gestured to a cluster of markers representing Varkos's expected deployment zones, then to another showing Kalen's aligned units. The third cluster, hidden deep within a network of urban ruins, represented Hawk's own battered but resolute army. This was the anvil, waiting for the hammer. "You will lead your vanguard, alongside Varkos's main assault elements, directly into this sector," Hawk explained, tracing a path through the ruins. "It's a kill zone we've prepared, laced with anti-vehicle mines, pre-sighted heavy weapon emplacements, and concealed infantry positions." The core of the deception was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Kalen was to act as the loyal ally, guiding Varkos's brutal legions into the pre-arranged slaughterhouse under the guise of a coordinated attack on a primary rebel stronghold. As Varkos's troops became fully committed within the confines of the trap, surrounded by Hawk's hidden forces, the signal would be given. That signal would trigger the most critical and dangerous phase of the operation. Kalen and his own soldiers would pivot. Their weapons, moments before aimed at Hawk's positions, would swing to target their erstwhile allies. Varkos's forces, caught between the sudden, unexpected fire from Kalen's troops and the unleashing of Hawk's concealed firepower, would be annihilated or captured. "It leaves no room for hesitation, Kalen," Hawk stressed, meeting the Martian's gaze. "The moment the signal comes, your men open fire on Varkos's units. Any delay, any doubt, and we are all destroyed. Varkos is cunning. He smells weakness and betrayal like a bloodhound." Kalen nodded slowly, the weight of the planned treachery heavy on his shoulders. He had made alliances of convenience before, but none so cold-blooded, none requiring such a direct, lethal betrayal of a current partner, however uneasy that partnership was. The success of the entire operation hinged on Kalen's ability to maintain the facade of loyalty until the precise, irreversible moment. It was a plan born of desperation, a high-stakes gambit where the price of failure was not just death, but the complete enslavement and destruction of Earth and the crushing of the rebellion. Kalen stood at the viewport, the cold, sterile light of the command deck reflecting the icy knot in his gut. Outside, the starfield offered no solace, only the vast, indifferent canvas against which his impossible dilemma played out. He was trapped between two betrayals, each promising a different kind of ruin, each demanding a sacrifice he wasn't sure he could make. On one hand stood Varkos, the Jovian general, a titan of brutality and strategic cunning. Their alliance was a pact with a devil, born of necessity and the grim calculus of survival in this savage war. Varkos offered power, resources, a path to victory paved with the crushed bones of enemies. To betray him now meant facing his terrifying wrath, unleashing a force that could obliterate Kalen's own weary troops. On the other was Hawk, the unwavering symbol of the Earth Rebellion, the man who embodied the ideals Kalen had once fought for, before the war had scoured them away like acid rain. Their secret confederation was a fragile link to a past where right and wrong felt clearer, a promise of a different future for Earth, free from tyranny. To betray Hawk was to extinguish that flicker of hope, to condemn millions to Varkas's iron fist, and to sever the last tie to the man he used to be. The plan was simple, horrifyingly so. Lead Varkas's fleet into Hawk's waiting trap, turn his guns on his temporary allies, watch the chaos erupt. It required cold blood, perfect timing, and a complete suppression of conscience. Kalen had committed atrocities in this war, had made compromises that gnawed at his soul, but this felt different. This was a calculated, intimate act of treachery against a man who, despite his monstrous nature, had placed a degree of twisted trust in him. Conversely, abandoning the plan meant abandoning Hawk, leaving Earth vulnerable to the full, unmitigated force of Varkos's assault. It meant watching the planet burn, its people enslaved or slaughtered, and knowing he had the means to prevent it, but chose not to. The weight of those potential lives crushed down on him, a silent scream in the back of his mind. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a torment of screaming faces, both Varkos's enraged roar and Hawk's disappointed gaze blurring into one accusatory visage. Food tasted like ash, and the camaraderie of his officers felt distant, alien. How could he lead them into such a pivotal moment when his own mind was a battlefield of conflicting loyalties and self-preservation? He paced the deck, his boots echoing in the tense silence. Every strategic assessment and every logistical detail of the impending attack circled back to the same agonizing question. Which path led to the least destruction? Which betrayal was the right one, if such a concept even existed anymore in this blood-drenched reality? The lines between hero and monster had long since dissolved, leaving only shades of gray and the imperative to survive. His advisors offered counsel, presenting tactical advantages and risks, but none could touch the core of his paralysis. They saw the chessboard. He saw the two men he was poised to sacrifice, or sacrifice for, depending on his choice. The cold logic of war demanded a decision, swift and brutal, but his hand hovered, frozen over the holographic controls. The clock was ticking. The jump coordinates were set. The fleets were converging. Soon there would be no more time for deliberation. The battle would begin, and in that maelstrom of violence, he would have to choose. The fate of Earth, and perhaps the entire solar system, hung precariously on the knife edge of his indecision. Yet, the paralysis held him fast. He was a general forged in the crucible of war, capable of ordering unimaginable destruction. But faced with this binary choice of betrayal, he was rendered inert. The weight of command, the burden of impossible decisions, had finally brought Kalen the Martian to a standstill, trapped in the suffocating silence before the storm. The pre-dawn light painted Earth's atmosphere in bruised purples and oranges, a false beauty that did little to soothe the raw tension gripping Kalen's gut. Today was the day the uneasy alliance with Varkos, the monster from Jupiter, would either solidify in conquest or shatter in a storm of betrayal. He stood on the bridge of the Martian Fury, watching the converging dots on the main screen swell into a monstrous armada. Beside his own grim Martian fleet, Varkos's ships were hulking, brutal shapes, designed for one purpose: utter devastation. Their sheer number was staggering, a testament to the Jovians' terrifying power and boundless ambition. Seeing them together, poised to strike his ancestral home, sent a cold shiver down Keelan's spine that had nothing to do with the vacuum of space. He ran a hand over the worn grip of his sidearm, a familiar weight that offered little comfort now. Every decision he had made, every compromise, every life taken or spared had led him to this precipice. Below, on the pale blue marble, Hawk waited. Hawk, the symbol of defiance, the man Kalen had secretly sworn allegiance to, was counting on him. The plan was simple, brutally so. Lead Varkas into the trap, turn on the Jovian general when Hawk gave the signal. It was a high-stakes gamble, a desperate attempt to decapitate the snake and give Earth a fighting chance. But it meant sending thousands of his own loyal soldiers and countless more of Varkos's into a pre-planned slaughter. The weight of that impending carnage pressed down on him, heavier than any Martian gravity. He had sacrificed his ideals piece by piece, justified each brutal choice as a necessity for survival, for victory. But this felt different. This was calculated deception on a scale that made his stomach churn. On Earth's surface, cities that had endured generations of quiet existence now bristled with hastily erected defenses. Civilians huddled in underground shelters, their fear a palpable wave even from orbit. Hawk's rebels, a diverse and battered force, manned the fortifications, their faces grim with the knowledge of the overwhelming force descending upon them. Varkos's voice crackled over the command channel, a low growl of anticipation. "Martian, are your forces in position? We breached the atmosphere in 05." There was no hint of suspicion in the Jovian's tone, only the eagerness of a predator closing in on its prey. Kalen's hand tightened on the comm panel, his mouth suddenly dry. He responded with a carefully measured reply, confirming their readiness, the lie feeling like ash on his tongue. The fate of millions, perhaps the entire solar system, hinged on the next few hours. Could he go through with it? Could he look his men in the eye after turning them into instruments of betrayal? The lead ships of the combined fleet sliced through the upper atmosphere, leaving fiery trails in their wake. The air crackled with energy, the prelude to the storm. Alarms began to wail on Earth, a mournful symphony of impending destruction. There was no turning back now. As the first transports began their descent, dropping like metal rain towards the waiting planet below, Kalen stared at the screen, his reflection a haunted stranger staring back. The day of the attack had arrived. The time for indecision was over. Only the brutal reality of war remained. The sky above Earth turned a sickly metallic gray as the combined fleets of General Varkos and Keelan's forces breached the atmosphere. Thousands of warships, their hulls scarred from countless skirmishes, hung like predatory birds over the unsuspecting cities and ravaged countryside. It wasn't an invasion. It was an annihilation, a deliberate, brutal descent upon a world already bleeding from years of civil strife. Drop pods, like fiery tears, streaked through the upper atmosphere, slamming into the ground with concussive force. They disgorged legions of heavily armored soldiers, a tide of Jovian and Martian troops converging on predetermined targets. The air filled instantly with the thunderous roar of engines, the shriek of descending ordnance, and the sickening crunch of collapsing structures. On the ground, the battle was a maelstrom of plasma fire and kinetic rounds. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust and twisted metal, their foundations vaporized by energy weapons. Streets became charnel houses, choked with debris and the rapidly cooling bodies of soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire. The fighting was close, brutal, and utterly indiscriminate. Jovian shock troops, massive and clad in obsidian armor, tore through barricades with terrifying efficiency, their heavy pulse rifles spitting death. Martian rebels, leaner but just as ruthless, moved with a desperate ferocity, their tactics born of survival in a harsh world. Casualties mounted with horrifying speed on all sides. There was no clean kill in this conflict, only dismemberment, incineration, and slow, agonizing death. The ground ran slick with blood and oil, a grotesque mixture that seeped into the shattered pavement and the churned earth of parks and fields. Defenders fought with the desperate courage of those protecting their home, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Their lines buckled under the sheer weight of the assault, pockets of resistance swallowed whole by the relentless tide of attackers. Every meter gained was paid for in lives, a brutal transaction of flesh for territory. The air itself seemed to weep, thick with the acrid smell of burnt circuitry, ozone from plasma blasts, and the metallic tang of spilled blood. The constant cacophony of battle was punctuated by the screams of the wounded, the dying, and those simply witnessing the utter destruction of their world. Amidst the chaos, officers barked orders, their voices strained against the din of war. Medics, overwhelmed and under-equipped, scrambled through the wreckage, attempting futilely to staunch the flow of life from shattered bodies. Hope was a distant, mocking whisper in the face of such overwhelming violence. Entire city blocks were reduced to smoking craters, landmarks erased from existence in minutes. The vibrant life that had once pulsed through Earth's arteries was being systematically extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of conquest and annihilation. This was not war as strategists drew it. This was pure, unadulterated butchery. Yet, beneath the surface of this joint assault, a dangerous undercurrent flowed. Kalen's forces fought alongside Varkos's. Tia tension, a subtle shift in their formations, hinted at something more. It was a performance, a brutal, bloody play being enacted on the global stage, leading towards a betrayal that would be as devastating as the assault itself. Amidst the hellish symphony of plasma fire and collapsing structures, a flicker of light erupted from the distant Earth-held lines. It was the prearranged signal, a burst of emerald fire against the smoke-choked sky. Hawk had given the word. The moment of truth, the razor's edge of Kalen's double dealing, had arrived, demanding a choice stained in blood regardless of the path taken. Kalen saw it, a cold knot tightening in his gut. His hand hovered over the comms panel, the order poised on his tongue. Betrayal. The word tasted like ash. He looked out at the swirling, brutal battle, at the Martian troops fighting shoulder to shoulder with Varkus's Jovian behemoths, a grotesque parody of alliance forged in desperation and deceit. For a crucial, agonizing moment, the war seemed to freeze around him. The faces of dead rebels flashed in his mind, then the cold, calculating gaze of Varkos. His initial ideals, the fire that had driven him from the Martian dust, warred with the grim calculus of survival and power he had come to embrace. Hesitation was a luxury the battlefield did not afford. Then his eyes swept across the carnage, identifying the key points of Varkus's formation, the exposed flanks, the lines stretched thin by their combined assault on Earth. A strategic opening, raw and brutal, presented itself. It wasn't about justice anymore, not truly. It was about winning, about ensuring his own forces, his own people, survived this meat grinder. The fleeting glimpse of a path to seize control, however narrow, hardened his resolve. His hand slammed down on the activation stud. His voice, raw and amplified, cut through the comms channels, overriding the battle chatter. All Martian units, target designation, Jovian forces, execute Plan Red, execute now. The words were a death knell to trust, a declaration of war against their temporary allies. Across the ravaged landscape, the impossible happened. Martian energy weapons, moments before spitting death at Earth defenders, swiveled with chilling precision. The distinctive crimson beams lanced out, not at the entrenched Earth rebels, but into the backs and flanks of the unsuspecting Jovian soldiers and armored vehicles they had just been supporting. Confusion rippled through Varkos's ranks, quickly followed by shock and then the primal scream of betrayal. Friendlies were firing on them. Their own allies had turned. The sudden, unexpected onslaught from within their formation shattered their cohesion, turning coordinated units into panicked, exposed targets. From the front, Hawk's Earth rebels, who had momentarily paused at the signal, unleashed a renewed, furious barrage. They pressed forward, sensing the shift, the sudden vulnerability of their attackers. Kalen's forces, now attacking from the rear and sides, created a deadly pincer movement. General Varkus, a mountain of a man even in the chaos, roared in disbelief and incandescent fury as he witnessed the treachery unfolding. His command staff scrambled, shouting orders, but the sudden reversal was devastating. His army, caught completely off guard, was being torn apart between two converging fires. The trap had sprung perfectly. Varkos found himself and his remaining loyal legions suddenly isolated, surrounded on all fronts by forces bent on his destruction. The ground battle, already a bloodbath, escalated into a frantic, desperate struggle for survival as the Jovian general realized the full, horrifying extent of Kalen's brutal double cross. Varkos, the seasoned general, a titan forged in countless campaigns of slaughter and conquest, did not crumble under the sudden, devastating betrayal. Surprise flickered across his harsh features for only a fraction of a second, a fleeting weakness immediate, easily replaced by a cold, calculating rage. He roared orders, his voice amplified by his helmet's comms, cutting through the sudden cacophony of friendly fire and enemy assault. His remaining loyal forces, the hardened core of the Jovian legions who had followed him through hells untold, didn't hesitate. They were veterans of brutal close-quarters meat grinders, bred for exactly this kind of desperate stand. They stopped their advance, abandoning their previous objectives, and immediately began to dig in, transforming their position from an attacking front into a defiant, bloody bastion. The fighting, already a horrific spectacle of violence and destruction, escalated instantly into something far more savage, brutal, and utterly desperate. The lines blurred entirely as soldiers from three factions found themselves locked in a chaotic, swirling melee. The tactical precision of moments before dissolved into a raw, primal struggle for survival. Plasma bolts crisscrossed the air, tearing through armor and flesh with equal indifference. Kinetic rounds ripped through bodies, spraying crimson mist. The guttural roars of charging soldiers mingled with the screams of the dying and the sickening crunch of bone and metal underfoot. Every meter of ground became a battleground where lives were measured in heartbeats. Blood, thick and coppery, began to pool in the shallow trenches and craters. It stained the dust and the shattered remains of vehicles, a grim testament to the sudden turn of events. The air grew heavy with the metallic tang of spilled life and the acrid stench of burnt ozone and propellant. Bodies, whole or in pieces, began to litter the battlefield everywhere the eye could see. They lay twisted and broken, a macabre tapestry woven from the lives of those who had been enemies just moments before. Now united in their shared fate as casualties of Varkos's desperate gambit and Kalen's ruthless betrayal. Close quarters combat intensified to a fever pitch. Soldiers discarded ranged weapons in favor of combat knives, axes, and even their bare hands, grappling in a brutal, intimate struggle for dominance. The sounds of blasters gave way to the wet thud of impacts and the ragged gasps of men fighting for their last breath. Kalen watched from a distance, a knot tightening in his gut. He had expected Varkos's line to shatter, to break and flee under the shock of being surrounded. Instead, he witnessed the terrifying resilience of the old general and his core troops, their desperate defense turning the battlefield into an even more horrific charnel house than anticipated. Hawk, fighting alongside his Earth rebels, felt a grudging sense of respect for Varkos's ability to adapt under fire, even as they poured everything they had into crushing the trapped Jovians. This was not the swift victory they had planned. This was a brutal, grinding meat grinder that would cost them dearly. The Jovian soldiers, cornered and facing annihilation, fought with the ferocity of trapped beasts. They knew there was no retreat, only the grim certainty of death or capture. Their desperation fueled a brutal efficiency. Each swing of a vibro axe, each burst of plasma, aimed with lethal intent. The ground underfoot became slick with gore, making footing treacherous. The chaos was absolute, a maelstrom of violence where friend and foe were sometimes indistinguishable in the swirling dust and smoke. Survival depended on instinct, brutality, and sheer, unadulterated luck. Every second that passed saw more and more bodies join the growing pile. The air was thick with the cries of the wounded, a symphony of pain that underscored the horrific reality of their situation. This was the brutal price of betrayal, paid in the currency of blood and shattered lives. The immediate shock of Kalen's betrayal had passed, replaced by a raw, desperate fury that fueled Varkos's initial order to hold ground. His troops, the pride of Jupiter's brutal legions, had responded with ined discipline, forming ragged defensive perimeters amidst the unexpected crossfire. But discipline could only carry them so far against the sheer, relentless pressure now hammering them from two sides. Kalen's Martians, agile and vicious in their close-quarters assault, tore into Varkos's flanks. Simultaneously, Hawk's Earth rebels, fighting with the ferocity of cornered animals defending their home, drove hard against the Jovian front lines. The battlefield, moments ago a scene of coordinated destruction, had become a meat grinder for Varkos's forces. Plasma fire crisscrossed the air, tearing through armor and flesh with equal ease. Explosions sent geysers of dust and pulverized rock into the toxic atmosphere. The air, thick with the metallic tang of spilled blood and the acrid smell of burnt circuitry, became increasingly difficult to breathe for the Jovian soldiers. Every meter of ground gained or lost was paid for in lives. The Jovian war machine, built for sweeping conquests and overwhelming power, was not designed for this kind of protracted, surrounded slugfest. Their heavy weapons were less effective in the tight confines, and their superior numbers were rapidly becoming irrelevant as they were whittled down. Faces hardened by countless campaigns began to show cracks of exhaustion and fear. The relentless waves of attackers, fueled by betrayal and righteous fury, seemed endless. For every rebel they cut down, two more seemed to rise from the dust, their weapons spitting death. The comm channels, once filled with Varkos's commanding roar and tactical directives, were now a chaotic symphony of panicked shouts, cries of pain, and the guttural screams of dying men. Officers tried desperately to coordinate defenses, but the lines were breaking faster than they could be reinforced. bodies piled up around fortified positions. Fallen comrades became grisly obstacles, their still forms adding to the grim tableau of defeat that was beginning to spread across the battlefield. The vibrant, terrifying might of Varkas's army was visibly bleeding out onto the scorched earth. Ammo reserves dwindled. Power cells for energy weapons flickered and died. The Jovian soldiers fought with the desperation of those who knew they were trapped. But even that primal urge was beginning to yield to the crushing reality of their situation. They were losing, and losing badly. Varkas watched from his temporary command post, the cold fury in his eyes, warring with a dawning, bitter realization. His carefully constructed plan had unraveled, leaving his prized legions exposed and vulnerable. The cost of Kaelin's treachery was being tallied in the rapidly mounting casualties of his own men. The sheer volume of enemy fire, the relentless pressure from Kaelin's cunning maneuver, and Hawk's desperate defense was simply too much. Varkas's army, for all its legendary might, was being systematically dismantled, its numbers shrinking with horrifying speed under the brutal, combined assault. Even as the screams of his dying soldiers echoed across the pockmarked plains of Earth, General Varkos felt a cold, strategic calm settle over him. The ground battle was deteriorating faster than anticipated. Kaelin's betrayal, though expected to some degree, had been executed with a sudden, brutal precision that had caught his front lines completely flat-footed. Losses mounted with terrifying speed, the combined might of Kaelin and Hawk's forces tearing gaping holes in his once impenetrable ranks. Yet Varkas did not panic. His mind, a complex engine of brutal logic and foresight, was already several steps ahead. This wasn't the first time an ally had turned on him, nor would it be the last in this savage war for the throne. Trust was a luxury few could afford, and Varkos, least of all, indulged in such weakness. He had always viewed Kaelin's alliance with a healthy, almost habitual suspicion. The Martian's history, his rapid rise from rebel figurehead, screamed of unpredictability, of a man who would ultimately serve his own perceived destiny above any pact. Knowing this, Varkas had woven a secondary layer into his meticulously crafted assault on Earth. A safety net, or more accurately, a secondary weapon, positioned and primed should the primary engagement dissolve into the very treachery he anticipated. He had not committed his entire strategic reserve to the ground fight, nor had he brought all his assets directly into the primary engagement zone. Hidden from planetary sensors and surveillance, nestled in the gravitational shadow on the far side of Earth's desolate, scarred moon, lay his devastating contingency, Bounty and his pirate fleet. A ragged, terrifying collection of warships, repurposed transports, and heavily armed gunships, crewed by slavers, mercenaries, and cutthroats who answered only to the promise of plunder and bloodshed, and to Varkos's considerable payments. Bounty, the brutal slaver who thrived on the chaos of the asteroid belt, was Varkos's unlikely but reliable partner in opportunistic violence. Their arrangement was simple and mutually beneficial. Bounty provided the unpredictable, savage force necessary for Varkos's darker stratagems, and Varkos provided the targets and the payoff. Their ships, cloaked and silent, had been waiting there for hours, a coiled viper ready to strike. Varkos had given Bounty explicit instructions: remain hidden, completely dark, and await the signal. That signal would only come if the primary assault faltered, if Kaelin proved to be the snake Varkos suspected him to be. Bounty's role was not to participate in the initial invasion, but to act as a hammer blow from an unexpected direction, a disruptive force designed to shatter the enemy lines and create an opening. Now, watching the grim reports filter back from the front lines, seeing the red indicators flash across his tactical displays, Varkos knew that the moment for the contingency was rapidly approaching. The losses were becoming unsustainable. The ground forces were being pushed back, their formation breaking under the relentless pressure from Kaelin's sudden heel turn and Hawk's waiting rebels. Behind the moon, Bounty's fleet was a silent, hungry beast. Their weapons were hot, their crews restless. They cared nothing for strategic objectives or planetary conquest, only for the signal that meant they could unleash hell and claim their bloody reward. Bounty himself, lounging on the bridge of his command ship, the Marauder's Scythe, grinned, anticipating the carnage. This hidden fleet represented Varkos's ultimate insurance policy. It wasn't just about winning this battle, it was about punishing betrayal and ensuring survival. He had calculated the risks, factored in the possibility of double cross, and prepared accordingly. Kalen and Hawk might have thought they had cornered the Jovian general, but they had only driven him towards a different, equally lethal path. The comm officer on Varkos's command ship flinched as another unit reported catastrophic losses. Varkos simply stared at the main display, his expression unreadable, a predator assessing the precise moment to spring a trap his enemies didn't even know existed. The signal was coming. The hidden fleet was about to become a very real, very brutal factor in the bloodbath below. General Varkos surveyed the carnage from his command post, the acrid smell of burnt plasma and spilled blood thick in the air. His Jovian troops, legendary for their resilience, were being systematically ground down between the hammering anvil of Hawk's Earth rebels and the unexpected hammer blow from Kalen's turned forces. The ground, moments ago a chaotic battleground, was becoming a cemetery for his loyal soldiers. Each fallen warrior was a stone in the monument to Kalen's treachery. Pride screamed for him to stand and fight, to reclaim the ground lost, to punish the turncoats with overwhelming force. But Varkos was not just a brute. He was a strategist who understood the grim calculus of war. The numbers were undeniable, etched in the dwindling readouts on his tactical display. His remaining forces were too few, too battered to break the pincer movement that had trapped them. Retreat was a bitter pill, a taste of defeat he rarely suffered. Yet, to stay would be annihilation, a catastrophic loss that would cripple his ambitions for the vacant throne. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his massive cheek. Survival, ugly and unheroic as it might feel in this moment, was the only path forward. The game was not over, merely shifting board. He keyed a secure channel, bypassing standard command protocols. This communication was reserved for only one contingency, one desperate measure held in reserve for precisely this kind of unforeseen disaster. The signal was short, coded, and urgent, a single burst transmitted towards the dark side of the nearby moon where his insurance plan waited. Miles away, orbiting unseen, Bounty's pirate fleet received the signal. The transmission was the green light they'd been waiting for, the call to unleash chaos for profit. Engines flared, silent in the vacuum, as the motley collection of warships, slavers, and repurposed freighters shifted trajectory, emerging from the moon's shadow like a swarm of metal locusts. There was no warning. One moment, Kalen and Hawk's forces were celebrating their apparent victory, pressing hard against Varkos's collapsing lines. The next, the sky tore open with energy fire from an unexpected direction. Bounty's ships, cannons blazing with savage abandon, slammed into the exposed flank of the Allied ground forces and their supporting vehicles. Confusion erupted like a plasma detonation. Soldiers looked up, caught between the enemy they were fighting and the new, brutal enemy raining death from above and the side. Comm channels crackled with panicked reports of ships appearing from nowhere, tearing through their formations with devastating efficiency. The pirates weren't aiming for strategic objectives, they were aiming for maximum carnage. Bounty's warships didn't bother with finesse. They unleashed torrents of autocannon fire, concussion missiles, and plasma bolts, ripping apart troop carriers, flattening entrenched positions, and turning swaths of the battlefield into smoking craters. Their attack was a shockwave of pure, unadulterated violence designed solely to shatter the enemy's cohesion. In the heart of the chaos caused by the sudden flanking attack, a gap began to appear in the enemy lines. Bounty's brutal assault was carving a bloody path, exactly as Varkos had gambled it would. It was the narrow window he needed, the lifeline thrown into the drowning maelstrom. All remaining units. Varkos roared into his command comm, his voice raw but authoritative. Withdraw, fall back to the transports, move. His battered troops, sensing the shift in the battle and the chance for survival, began to disengage, pulling back from the close-quarters slaughter. Covered by the relentless, indiscriminate fire of Bounty's fleet, Varkos's soldiers scrambled across the broken ground. They were a ragged, depleted force, leaving behind their dead and wounded, but they were moving, retreating towards the waiting landing zones where their ships stood ready to lift them from the planet's surface. The ground battle was lost, but the war, thanks to Bounty's timely intervention, was not yet over for Varkos. General Varkos, a hulking shadow against the burning sky, clawed his way back towards the gaping maw of his command ship. Around him, the retreat was a controlled chaos, the Jovian forces, battered but not broken, falling back under the sudden, brutal onslaught from Bounty's pirate fleet. The air screamed with energy fire and the tearing of hulls, but Varkos's mind was singularly focused, a furnace of white-hot fury fueled by Kalen's treachery. He burst onto the bridge, the polished metal cool beneath his heavy boots. A stark contrast to the inferno raging outside. Officers barked orders, screens flickered with tactical data, but Varkos ignored them all. His eyes, cold and hard as Jovian ice, swept across the battlefield unfolding on the main view screen, searching through the smoke and debris. And then he saw him. Kalen, the betrayer, standing exposed in the open ground below, a lone figure amidst the scattered bodies of friend and foe alike. He wasn't seeking cover, wasn't directing troops. He simply stood there, a target framed against the ravaged landscape, a monument to Keelan's calculated double cross. The sight ignited something primal within Varkos. The strategic retreat, the need to regroup, all faded before the overwhelming need for immediate, visceral retribution. Kalen had made a fool of him, had spat on their precarious alliance in the bloodiest way imaginable. He would pay for it now. Plasma rifle, Varkos snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the bridge's din. A general, startled but obedient, quickly unslung the heavy weapon from his shoulder and handed it over. The weapon felt solid and familiar in Varkos's massive hands, its power a comforting weight. He brought the rifle to his shoulder, the targeting scope flipping down over his eye. The digital reticle settled over Kalen's chest, locking onto the heat signature. The distance was negligible. This wasn't a battlefield shot. This was an execution. Varkos felt a grim satisfaction tighten his grip on the trigger. Below, Kalen remained oblivious, perhaps lost in the immediate aftermath of the battle, the shifting loyalties, the sudden turn of events. He was a statue of contemplation amidst the ruins, a perfect stationary target for Varkos's vengeance. The hum of the plasma rifle powering up filled Varkos's ears, a prelude to death. But then, a flash of movement. From the corner of his eye, Varkos registered another figure, smaller, faster, lunging forward from the side. It was Hawk, the Earth General, his face a mask of desperate urgency as he sprinted towards Keelan. Hawk didn't hesitate. With a final burst of speed, he threw himself at Keelan, tackling him hard and shoving him violently out of the direct line of fire. Kalen stumbled, caught off guard, pushed roughly aside just as Varkos's finger tightened on the trigger. The plasma bolt erupted from the rifle, a searing lance of concentrated energy. It wasn't aimed at Kalen anymore. Instead, the incandescent blast slammed directly into Hawk's back, tearing through his combat armor with a sickening hiss and a flash of brilliant, terrible light. The plasma bolt tore through Hawk, a searing, incandescent line of destruction that ripped through his chest. He crumpled instantly, the force of the impact throwing him backward onto the blood-soaked ground. The vibrant energy that had defined him moments before was extinguished, replaced by a horrifying stillness, broken only by the gushing crimson staining his torn uniform. Kalen watched, frozen for a microsecond, the image seared into his vision. Hawk, the unyielding leader, the symbol of Earth's defiance, falling like a broken marionette. The shock was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs, before a tidal wave of raw, unadulterated fury crashed over him. Around them, the Earth rebels, witnessing the fall of their general, let out a collective roar of anguish and rage. Grief transformed instantly into a savage, desperate violence. Their discipline shattered, replaced by a primal urge to avenge their fallen leader, to make the retreating enemy pay in blood. Heavy weapons, plasma cannons, and kinetic slug throwers that had been focused elsewhere now swiveled, spitting torrents of destructive energy and metal towards Varkos's and Bounty's fleeing vessels. The air screamed with inbound fire, a desperate, furious barrage intended to shred their hulls and bury them in the debris of their own escape. Aboard his command ship, Varkos watched the chaotic sea withdrawal, a grim satisfaction warring with cold calculation. He had struck a blow, a personal one, but the trap had cost him. His forces were battered, his position compromised. Prolonging the fight now would be folly. The throne awaited, and survival was the first step. Bounty's pirate fleet, their cannons still hot from carving the escape path, added their own fire to the retreating maneuver. Profit and survival were their only masters. They had done their part, extracted their price, and lingering to finish a fight that wasn't strictly theirs was a risk they wouldn't take. Their ships, faster and more agile, began pulling ahead, leaving Varkas's heavier vessels to bear the brunt of the rebels' wrath. The retreat was not clean. Rebel fire found its marks, tearing chunks from hulls, igniting fuel lines, sending crippled transports spiraling down to crash into the ravaged surface below. The void around them, filled with the expanding clouds of debris and the silent screams of those trapped within the dying ships. But the sheer volume of fire from the combined fleets, coupled with the element of surprise, had worked. A ragged, bloody path was cleared, wide enough for the main body of Varkas's surviving forces and Bounty's pirates to disengage completely, vanishing into the tactical cover of the moon they had used for their ambush. Silence, or a grim semblance of it, fell back over the battlefield. The furious roar of weapons subsided, replaced by the crackle of burning wreckage and the low moans of the wounded. The ground was a charnel house littered with the broken bodies of soldiers from all sides, a testament to the brutal efficiency of war and betrayal. Kalen knelt beside Hawk, the acrid smell of burnt flesh and ozone filling his nostrils. The fury hadn't dissipated, but it was now laced with a profound, aching loss. The battlefield was won, the immediate threat repelled, but the cost was laid bare before him, bleeding out onto the scorched earth. Kalen scrambled across the blood-soaked ground, the acrid smell of burnt flesh and plasma filling the air. The retreating roar of Varkas's ships and Bounty's fleet was a fading echo against the ringing in his ears. Nothing else mattered but the figure crumpled near the smoldering crater where moments before he had stood. Hawk. His ally, his conscience, the man who had just taken the blast, meant for him. He reached Hawk's side, skidding to a halt. The wound was catastrophic, a gaping, cauterized mess on his chest where the plasma rifle had hit. Hawk's uniform was shredded and smoking, the edges of the wound glowing faintly. Blood, impossibly red against the gray dust, pooled beneath him. "Hawk!" Kalen's voice was raw, a sound he hadn't heard escape his lips in months. He knelt, carefully supporting Hawk's head, trying to ignore the sticky warmth spreading onto his hands. The Earth Leader's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain, but still sharp, still focused. A weak, bloody cough shook Hawk's frame. "Kalen, you fool." The words were raspy, barely audible over the distant sounds of chaos. "Didn't think Varkos would miss." A grimace tightened his face, a flicker of the old defiance even now. "Why, Hawk? Why did you do that?" Kalen's grip tightened, a futile gesture against the life draining away. He felt a familiar, unwelcome surge of the idealism he thought he had buried, resurrected by this selfless act. Hawk's gaze locked onto Kalen's, intense despite the fading light in his eyes. He lifted a trembling hand, smearing blood across Kalen's armor. Listen to me, Martian." His voice gained a fragile strength, fueled by sheer will. This isn't over." He struggled for breath, each word a victory against the pain. "Promise me, Kalen. Promise me you'll keep fighting. Not for power, not for revenge. For them." He gestured weakly towards the city sprawled in the distance, the countless civilians caught in the crossfire. "Fight for the rebels, for Earth, Hawk play." Aided, his voice barely a whisper now. "Protect them. Don't let Varkos or anyone else turn them into slaves. Don't let this sacrifice be for nothing." His grip tightened on Kalen's arm, surprisingly strong. The weight of those words settled onto Kalen's shoulders, heavier than any armor. He looked into Hawk's eyes, seeing not just a dying soldier, but the embodiment of the cause he had once championed without compromise, the path he had strayed from. "I promise, Hawk," Kalen said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise. I'll keep fighting. I'll protect them." The vow felt like a brand, searing itself onto his weary soul, a reminder of the man he used to be, and a challenge to the man he was becoming. A faint smile touched Hawk's lips, a ghost of relief amidst the agony. His hand went limp, sliding from Kalen's arm. The light in his eyes dimmed, then went out, leaving behind a vacant stare fixed on the polluted sky. Kalen held him for a long moment, the stillness of Hawk's body, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of the battle's aftermath. Around them, the wounded cried out, the dying groaned, and the victorious rebels began to pick through the wreckage, but in Kalen's arms there was only silence and the profound, crushing weight of a promise made to a dead man. The news of Hawk's death ripped through the solar system like a solar flare, burning away complacency and igniting a firestorm of grief and fury. On Earth, the planet he had fought so desperately to protect, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Wails of anguish echoed through ruined cities, mingling with the low, guttural roars of soldiers who had lost not just a commander, but a symbol of their battered hope. For the Earth rebels already pushed to the brink by relentless assaults, Hawk's sacrifice was a brutal, agonizing blow. Many had followed him for years, drawn by his unwavering resolve and his defiant stand against tyranny. His death left a gaping wound in their ranks, a void that felt impossible to fill, yet simultaneously it hardened their resolve into something cold and dangerous. Kalen, still stained with Hawk's blood, felt the weight of the promise made in those final moments. The grief was a raw, tearing agony, but beneath it, a cold fury began to simmer. Hawk hadn't died for nothing. His sacrifice demanded a price, a reckoning that Kalen was now utterly committed to exacting, no matter the personal cost. Across the vast emptiness between planets, the news spread, carried by encrypted bursts and desperate transmissions. On Venus, Anya heard the reports with a sickening lurch. Hawk had represented a different kind of leader, one who still clung to shreds of humanity amidst the barbarity. His death felt like another piece of light extinguished in an increasingly dark galaxy, but it also solidified her own grim purpose. Even on Mars, Kalen's fractured homeworld, where loyalty was a fluid concept measured in credits and survival, Hawk's name was spoken with a mix of awe and sorrow. He was the Earth general who had dared to stand against the tide, and his fall served as a stark reminder of the stakes. For some, it was a cautionary tale. For others, a call to arms. Saturn's rigid society felt the ripples too. Zara, the defector, felt a chilling premonition. Hawk's boldness had been infectious, a beacon for those chafing under oppressive regimes. His death would not be forgotten. It would become a rallying cry, potentially drawing more eyes and more danger towards anyone associated with the rebellion. The grief was immense, a collective ache felt by millions who had looked to Hawk as a potential liberator. His image, once a symbol of defiance, was now etched with the grim finality of martyrdom. But as the initial shock subsided, grief began to calcify into something far more potent, a burning desire for retribution. Hawk's sacrifice, intended to save Kalen and rally his forces, succeeded on a terrible scale. The Earth rebels, instead of fracturing, closed ranks, their sorrow transmuted into a fierce, unyielding determination. Every fallen comrade, every ruined city, every memory of Hawk fueled their resolve to fight until their last breath. Throughout the solar system, whispers turned into shouts. Hawk's death wasn't just a loss, it was proof of the enemy's brutality and a stark reminder of what awaited anyone who dared oppose them. This realization, however painful, galvanized resistance in unexpected corners, unifying disparate groups under the banner of shared loss and a common enemy. The symbolic weight of Hawk's passing became immense. He was no longer just a general, he was a martyr. His final act a testament to courage and selflessness. His name became a password, a prayer, and a curse, invoked by rebels and civilians alike, who swore that his sacrifice would not be in vain, that his memory would fuel the fires of rebellion until victory or annihilation. While the solar system bled, planets tearing at each other like rabid beasts, Elias the Mercurian remained cloistered in the scorching heart of his world. The raw data streams reaching his hidden laboratory spoke of fire, betrayal, and the relentless grind of death, a grim counterpoint to the quiet hum of the ancient machinery he painstakingly unearthed. His hands, stained with the dust of millennia, traced the intricate patterns etched into the obsidian console. This wasn't just technology, it was a forgotten language, a blueprint for manipulating the very fabric of existence. The Mercurian ruins were not tombs, but libraries, holding knowledge that could either mend the fractured solar system or shatter it completely. For weeks, the fragments of data had coalesced into a terrifyingly beautiful picture. He saw not just weapons, though their potential was immense and horrifying, but also systems of connection, networks of energy flow that could link the planets in ways no current FTL drive or comms array ever could. a genuine path to unity powered by the ancients. Yet, the same principles that allowed for seamless connectivity also described energies capable of shearing moons from their orbits or collapsing stars. The power was indifferent to intent, a raw force waiting to be directed. And the war outside his sanctuary howled with intentions far from peaceful. Elias, the pacifist historian, felt the weight of this knowledge like a physical burden. He had sought truth, not power, yet power was precisely what he had found, naked and absolute. Every equation he deciphered, every artifact he activated, pulled him deeper into a maelstrom he had desperately tried to avoid. He thought of the reports from Earth, of Kalen's brutal tactics, of Varkus's unending cruelty. Could this ancient power be the only way to force an end to the madness, to impose a peace? The thought was a serpent in his mind, whispering justifications for wielding a force that terrified him. The temptation was immense. He saw the chaos, the injustice, the endless suffering. He believed, perhaps narcissistically, that he could be the one to handle this power responsibly, to be the just hand that guided the solar system out of the darkness. It was a dangerous thought, born of desperation. His fingers hovered over a sequence of glyphs on the console. Activating this segment would initiate the energy network, making the potential for both peace and destruction a tangible reality. The air in the chamber grew warm, charged with latent power, mirroring the storm brewing within his own soul. He remembered the ancient text describing the downfall of the civilization that built this place. A civilization that ultimately destroyed itself with the very power Elias now held in his hands. A stark warning etched not just in stone, but in the silence of dead worlds. The choice was his alone. Share this power, risking its immediate weaponization by ruthless factions, or keep it, attempt to control it, and risk becoming the very tyrant he abhorred. The hum of the ancient technology seemed to intensify, a silent clock counting down towards a decision that would redefine the solar system's future, for better or unimaginable worse. Across the solar system, away from the thunderous clash of Kalen and Varkus's fleets above Earth, the war carved its brutal path through countless lives. Minor planetary governors, once secure in their local power, found their worlds becoming pawns or battlegrounds for the major players. Loyalties shifted like desert sands, alliances were forged and shattered within cycles, and the cost of backing the wrong side was often total annihilation, leaving behind only smoking craters and mass graves where cities once stood. On the ice moons of Jupiter, far from Varkos's command center, local mining barons who had sworn fealty to the Jovian banner now faced the agonizing choice between feeding their starving workers or hoarding meager supplies to appease their distant warlord. Some turned to desperate piracy, preying on what little civilian transport remained. Others simply watched their communities collapse into anarchy, the brutal order of the battlefield replacing the rule of law. Elias, sequestered on scorching Mercury, felt the tremors of distant battles through the ancient stone of the ruins he explored. Each new glyph deciphered, each schematic unlocked, revealed a power capable of ending the conflict in an instant, but at a price that gnawed at his pacifist soul. Could he, in good conscience, unleash a force that might save billions from war, only to risk an even greater ancient destruction? The weight of that decision pressed down on him, a silent war within his own mind. On the once serene moons of Saturn, Zara navigated the treacherous currents of defection. Her intimate knowledge of Saturnian fleet movements saved countless rebel lives, yet the ghosts of her past actions, the operations she had flown under the command of the rigid hierarchy, haunted her sleep. She sought redemption not on the bridge of a capital ship, but in quiet acts of sabotage and intelligence gathering, knowing each success painted a larger target on her back. For the common folk, the war was not a grand strategy or a noble cause, but a daily struggle for survival. Ration lines stretched for kilometers, scavengers picked through the debris of bombed-out settlements, and the constant drone of warships overhead was a chilling lullaby. Families were torn apart by forced conscription, summary executions, or the grim necessity of fleeing everything they had ever known with nowhere safe to go. Reports filtered back from the furthest reaches of the system, of Venusian settlements choked by atmospheric attacks, Martian outposts overrun by brutal mercenaries, and belt stations turned into auction blocks for the slave trade, facilitated by figures like Bounty. The scale of the suffering was immense, a silent scream lost beneath the roar of plasma cannons and the propaganda of warring factions. Even on Earth, away from the main battle lines, where Kalen and Varkos now bled, pockets of resistance and civilian enclaves faced their own private hells. Occupation forces were merciless, collaborators were hunted, and the simple act of existing became an act of defiance, punishable by torture or death. The moral lines blurred completely for those forced to make impossible choices just to see another dawn. Lower-ranking soldiers, the expendable cogs in the war machine, witnessed horrors their commanders would never see. They were the ones who saw friends vaporized, who were ordered to commit atrocities, who froze in fear or raged in desperation in the brutal close-quarters combat that defined much of the ground war. Their idealism, if they ever had any, was scoured away by the acid of relentless violence. The rise of warlords and petty tyrants in the vacuum of central authority added another layer of torment. Without oversight, without law, those with the most firepower or the cruelest heart carved out fiefdoms built on fear and exploitation. Planetary leaders fell, replaced by figures even more brutal, their reigns marked by summary justice and the casual disregard for civilian life that became the norm. This was the true face of the Civil War. Not just the epic clashes of generals and fleets, but the million small tragedies unfolding simultaneously across the solar system. It was the slow erosion of humanity under unimaginable pressure, the desperate fight for a scrap of dignity or survival, and the profound, often fatal, moral compromises demanded of everyone caught in the crossfire. The solar system held its breath. After years of relentless, soul-crushing conflict, of planets scarred and populations decimated, the final act was upon them. Every skirmish, every betrayal, every agonizing sacrifice had led to this single, inescapable moment, a convergence of forces that would either forge a new grim order or shatter the remnants of civilization into dust. From the swirling storms of Jupiter, Varkas's colossal fleet, bolstered by the brutal warships of Bounty's asteroid belt pirates, moved with predatory precision. Their armada, a dark stain against the void, represented the raw, unyielding ambition of tyranny and the monstrous profit of chaos. Opposing them, Kalen's combined forces, a desperate alliance of Martian rebels, battered Earth survivors still reeling from Hawk's death, and various other factions forged in the crucible of resistance, gathered with grim determination. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but fueled by a burning, desperate need to prevent Varkas and Bounty from claiming absolute dominion. Across the vast distances, ships maneuvered into position, their weapon systems glowing with contained fury. The silence before the storm was deafening, a cosmic pause filled with the unspoken fears and grim resolves of millions. This wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a fight for the very soul of the solar system, a winner-take-all collision of ideologies and raw power. Down on the surface of contested worlds and hidden within the guts of starships, engineers like Anya worked feverishly. Their fight was different, quieter but no less vital, patching damaged systems, tending to the wounded, trying to salvage hope and life from the encroaching wave of destruction. Every repair, every life saved, was an act of defiance. Elsewhere, Elias, burdened by the weight of ancient knowledge, contemplated his final, terrifying gambit. The secrets he had unearthed held the potential for salvation, a way to end the war decisively, but they also whispered of a power so immense, so uncontrollable, that its unleashment might be worse than the war itself. His internal conflict mirrored the external chaos, and somewhere in the vanguard, Zara, the defected Saturnian pilot, prepared for a maneuver that defied logic and courted death. Her past haunted her, fueling a desperate need for redemption that could only be found in the heart of this final, bloody maelstrom. Her skills, honed in countless brutal dogfights, were now the razor's edge upon which victory or defeat might rest. The scale was unprecedented. Thousands of ships, millions of lives, converging on a single predetermined point in the void. The strategic minds had planned, the warriors had trained, but the true architect of this climax was the war itself, a ravenous entity demanding a final, ultimate sacrifice. There would be no retreat, no parley, only the brutal, unadulterated clash of everything that remained. The solar system, birthplace of humanity, was about to become its graveyard, or perhaps, just perhaps, the blood-soaked ground from which something new, something scarred but resilient, might eventually rise. The comm channels were thick with static, the air charged with anticipation and dread. Every eye turned towards the converging fleets, towards the point where history would be written in plasma fire and shattered hulls. The climax had arrived, and its horror would echo across the light years for generations to come. The final confrontation ignited not as a calculated ballet of maneuvers, but as a raw, screaming collision of metal and flesh. Kalen stood on the bridge of the ironclad, the grim light of 1,000 explosions reflecting in his eyes. Years of war had stripped away the last vestiges of his idealism, leaving behind only the cold, sharp edge of command forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss. This wasn't just a battle, it was the solar system's death throes, a desperate lunge for the throne that would leave nothing but ruin in its wake. Across the void, Varkas's colossal Jovian fleet loomed, a dark, implacable wave of destruction. Beside them, the jagged, predatory ships of Bounty's asteroid belt raiders swarmed, adding their chaotic, brutal energy to the enemy formation. The alliance, born of shared ruthlessness and a hunger for dominion, was a terrifying sight, a testament to the depths of depravity the war had unearthed. Kalen's forces, a ragged mix of Martian rebels, battered Earth fleets, and defectors from every corner of the system, met the onslaught head-on. There was no strategic finesse now, only brute force and the desperate will to survive. Cannons roared across the vacuum, energy beams sliced through shields, and ships exploded in silent, expanding spheres of debris and dying light. The comms channels were a cacophony of orders, screams, and the static of destroyed connections. On the ground, the fighting was even more visceral. Drop pods slammed into contested planetary surfaces, disgorging soldiers who immediately plunged into a maelstrom of laser fire and explosive ordnance. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble in minutes, their populations caught between the advancing armies, praying for a swift end that rarely came. Varkos's ground troops, genetically engineered for combat and utterly loyal, advanced with terrifying, methodical precision. They were shock troops, designed to break lines and sow terror, their heavy armor deflecting all but the most direct hits. Behind them came Bounty's irregulars, a savage horde of slavers and pirates who fought with a feral abandon, interested only in plunder and the thrill of the kill. Kalen himself led from the front, a strategic necessity and a personal compulsion. He moved through the chaos, a figure both feared and respected, his orders sharp and decisive. Every kill was a calculation, every loss a cold weight added to the already crushing burden on his soul. He fought not for justice anymore, but for survival, for the grim chance to impose his vision on the ashes. The air, thick with the smell of ozone and burnt flesh, choked the combatants. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in trenches and ruined buildings, a desperate, bloody ballet of bayonets, combat knives, and the raw, brutal force of human and non-human bodies tearing each other apart. Mercy was a forgotten concept, a relic of a time before the throne became the only thing that mattered. Bounty's raiders were particularly brutal in their ground assaults, their tactics designed to break the enemy's will through sheer terror. They took no prisoners, reveled in torture, and left a trail of unspeakable atrocities in their wake. Their presence on the battlefield was a grim reminder of the moral decay that had infected the entire solar system. The clash wasn't just between armies, it was a collision of philosophies, or rather, the utter lack thereof. This was a fight for absolute dominion, where power was the only currency and the lives of billions were merely chips in the deadliest game ever played. The stakes were clear. Victory meant everything, and defeat meant annihilation, enslavement, or worse. As the battle raged, the ground shook with the impact of orbital bombardments, and the sky burned with the trails of countless missiles and torpedoes. The sheer scale of the destruction was breathtaking, a horrifying spectacle of technological might turned inward. Kalen watched it all, the architect of this final, bloody chapter, knowing that no matter the outcome, the solar system would never be the same. The ground shuddered beneath Anya's boots, a constant, jarring tremor that spoke of distant bombardments. Dust and debris rained down from the fractured ceilings of the makeshift clinic she had established in the ruins of a data archive. Outside, the sounds of the final battle were a deafening symphony of destruction. The shriek of atmospheric fighters, the concussive thud of heavy ordnance, the tearing roar of all lapsing structures. She moved with practiced efficiency, her hands stained with grime and blood, her face streaked with sweat. Around her lay the human cost of Kalen's brutal push and Varkas's desperate stand, civilians caught in the merciless grinder of war. Children whimpered, clutching tattered blankets. Adults lay still, their eyes wide with shock or closed in pain. This was her front line, far from the grand strategic maneuvers and the clashes of starships. It was a battle fought with dwindling medical supplies, ration packs, and the sheer exhausting force of will. Every bandage applied, every drop of water given, every whispered word of comfort felt like a defiant act against the overwhelming tide of violence. A young woman screamed as Anya cleaned a deep laceration on her arm, shrapnel tearing through flesh. Anya held her gaze, murmuring reassurances, her own fear a tight knot in her stomach. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of burnt plastique, a constant reminder of the hellscape outside. Resources were critically low. They had salvaged what they could from abandoned shops and collapsed buildings, but the flow of supplies had long since dried up. Every sterile wipe, every painkiller, every power cell for the emergency lights was precious, stretched thin across too many desperate needs. She saw faces she recognized: a shopkeeper from the promenade, a teacher from the local school, families she had passed in the streets just weeks ago, living ordinary lives. Now they were refugees in their own city, broken and terrified, their homes reduced to rubble, their futures uncertain. Anya felt the weight of Kalen's choices pressing down on her. His ascent had been fueled by necessary brutality, he argued, but the collateral damage was immense, heartbreakingly visible in every pale, injured face she tended. She understood the grim calculus of war, but witnessing its raw impact was a different kind of burden. She helped a team of exhausted volunteers distribute water, pushing back against the crush of thirsty, desperate hands. The fear in their eyes was a physical thing, palpable and suffocating. They didn't understand the grand strategies or the fight for the throne. They only knew hunger, pain, and the terrifying uncertainty of the next moment. As a distant explosion shook the building again, rattling the emergency lights, Anya didn't flinch. There was no time for fear, only for action. Another casualty was brought in, a young boy with a head wound. She knelt, her hands steady despite the trembling of the earth, and began her work. In the heart of the storm, amidst the chaos and the dying, Anya was an anchor. Not a warrior wielding weapons, but a healer wielding compassion, a fragile shield against the crushing weight of the war. Her fight was quiet, desperate, and utterly vital, a testament to the enduring human spirit in a system drowning in blood. She organized small groups, guiding them through collapsed tunnels and debris-strewn alleyways towards what they hoped were safer sectors. Each step was fraught with peril. Unstable structures, downed power lines, the risk of encountering hostile patrols or desperate looters. She moved with a weary determination. The sheer scale of the suffering was overwhelming. She saw families huddled together, shivering in the cold, their belongings reduced to whatever they could carry. She heard stories of unimaginable loss, of loved ones vaporized in orbital strikes or crushed under falling buildings. Each story added another layer to the heavy cloak of despair. Despite the relentless brutality surrounding her, Anya refused to surrender to cynicism. She clung to the belief that even in the darkest hour, acts of kindness and solidarity mattered. They were small flickers of light in an encroaching blackness, reminders of the humanity that the war was trying so desperately to extinguish. She worked through the cycles of exhaustion and adrenaline, pushing her body and mind past their limits. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Rest was a concept that felt alien in this constant state of emergency. Her focus remained solely on the next person who needed her help, the next life she could perhaps touch or save. Deep within the fortified bowels of a derelict mining complex on the fringes of Mercury, Elias the Mercurian adjusted the humming energy conduits of the ancient device. The air crackled with contained power, older than any starship currently tearing through the void above. This was not a weapon of war in the conventional sense, but a relic designed to silence, to neutralize, to force tranquility upon a system gone mad. His hands, usually steady among delicate artifacts, trembled slightly.